The first thing my husband saw that morning was an empty crib. Not empty because something terrible had happened to our son. Empty because I was gone. The nursery was silent. The rocking chair sat still beside the window. The baby blankets had disappeared. Every bottle was gone. The framed ultrasound photo was missing from the shelf. And taped to the center of the crib was a single sheet of paper. 3 words. "Good luck, Richard." That was the moment he realized I hadn't been bluffing. The strange thing is, only 8 hours earlier he had been smiling. Smiling while he destroyed our marriage. It was 2 a.m. I was sitting in the nursery of our suburban Ohio home feeding my 2-month-old son Caleb. The house was dark except for the small lamp beside the rocking chair. I'd been awake for nearly an hour. At 62 years old, I wasn't exactly built for sleepless nights with a newborn. But life has a funny way of surprising you. After years of believing motherhood was behind me, my husband and I had become guardians of Caleb after a tragic family situation involving my late niece. He wasn't biologically ours. But from the moment I held him, he became my son. The doctors had warned me that caring for an infant at my age would be exhausting. They were right. Yet I loved every second of it. The tiny yawns, the little fingers wrapped around mine, the way he relaxed the moment he heard my voice. Those moments gave me purpose. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke the silence. I looked toward the window. Richard was finally home. Again. For months he'd been coming home later and later. Business dinners, client meetings, networking events. At least that was what he called them. The truth had become painfully obvious. The perfume, the secretive phone calls, the sudden obsession with expensive clothes, the gym membership, the way he checked his reflection every time we passed a mirror. Retirement had changed him. Or maybe it had simply revealed who he really was. I heard the front door open. Then footsteps. A few moments later, Richard appeared in the nursery doorway. His gray hair was slightly messy. His shirt wasn't tucked in. And even from across the room, I could smell the perfume. Not mine. Never mine. He leaned against the doorframe, then smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a guilty smile. The smile of a man who thought he'd already won. "Still awake?" he asked. I looked down at Caleb. "Someone has to take care of him." Richard laughed softly. It wasn't a pleasant sound. He stepped closer and tossed his car keys onto the changing table. Then he crossed his arms. "You know," I didn't answer. "My secretary is amazing." There it was. Not even an attempt to hide it anymore. I felt my stomach tighten. But I stayed quiet. Richard seemed disappointed by my lack of reaction. So he continued. "I spent the night with her." The room felt colder. Caleb shifted slightly in my arms. I adjusted his blanket. Richard paused, waiting, watching, hoping I'd cry, hoping I'd scream, hoping I'd beg. Instead, I just looked at my son. Then Richard grinned. "And I'm gonna do it again." The words hung in the air. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, he shook his head. "You don't even care." I looked at him. Really looked at him. The man I'd spent 12 years loving. The man who had promised to stand beside me through every season of life. The man who now smelled like another woman. And suddenly something inside me became very calm. Not angry. Not hysterical. Just calm. I nodded once. "Okay." His expression changed. Not much. Just enough. Because that wasn't the reaction he'd wanted. He wanted pain. Instead, I gave him peace. That confused him. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it." He stared another moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." A minute later, he disappeared down the hallway. I heard the television turn on in the living room. Then silence. Caleb had finished his bottle. I lifted him against my shoulder. He let out a tiny burp. I smiled despite everything. "Good job, sweetheart." For the next hour, I sat in the rocking chair, thinking, remembering, planning. Because the truth was, Richard's confession hadn't surprised me. What surprised me was how easy he'd made my decision. Months earlier, I'd started noticing things. Bank statements, withdrawals, missing money, strange charges. At first, I'd ignored them. Then I'd started keeping copies, just in case. A retired school librarian learns quickly that documentation matters. And I'd documented everything. Every receipt, every statement, every suspicious transfer. Without telling Richard I'd spoken to an attorney. Without telling Richard I'd protected certain assets. Without telling Richard I'd prepared for the possibility that one day I'd have to leave. That day had arrived. At 3:15 a.m., I carried Caleb into my bedroom. I packed 2 suitcases, baby clothes, diapers, medical records, photographs, important documents, the essentials. Nothing more. At 4 a.m., I quietly locked the bedroom door. Not because I was afraid. Because I didn't want interruptions. Richard slept on the couch that night. Or maybe he passed out there. I honestly didn't care. Just before sunrise, I placed Caleb in his car seat. Then I walked through the house one final time. The kitchen. The living room. The dining room where we'd celebrated anniversaries. The backyard where we'd hosted barbecues. 12 years of memories, some beautiful, some painful. All finished. At exactly 5:47 a.m., I carried my son outside. The morning air felt cool against my face. For the first time in months, I could breathe. I buckled Caleb into the car, started the engine, and drove away. 10 minutes later, I made a phone call. The attorney answered immediately. "Margaret?" I glanced at the rearview mirror. My son was sleeping peacefully. "It's time," I said. There was a brief pause. Then he replied quietly, "I'll start the process." As the sun rose over the highway, I kept driving. I didn't know exactly what my future looked like, but I knew one thing. Richard had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he had absolutely no idea what was coming next. By 7:30 that morning, I was standing in the driveway of a little blue cottage on Lake Erie, holding Caleb against my chest while the wind pushed cold mist off the water. The cottage had belonged to my Aunt Louise. She was my mother's older sister, the kind of woman who wore red lipstick to the grocery store and never apologized for taking up space. When she passed, she left the cottage to me with one handwritten note. "For the day you finally choose yourself." At the time, I thought it was sweet. That morning, I understood it. The place wasn't fancy. The porch leaned slightly to the left, the kitchen smelled faintly of old pine cabinets, and the bathroom sink had a slow drip I had never gotten around to fixing. But it was quiet. Safe. Mine. I brought Caleb inside, changed his diaper on an old quilt, then warmed a bottle in a saucepan because I hadn't packed the bottle warmer. While he drank, I sat at Aunt Louise's kitchen table and stared at my phone. Richard had called 17 times. Then came the texts. "Where are you? This isn't funny. Bring him back. You can't just take the baby." That last one made me laugh so quietly I almost didn't recognize the sound. For months, Richard had acted like Caleb was a burden. Too loud, too expensive, too much work. Now suddenly he was calling him the baby like he had rights without responsibility. I didn't answer. At 8:10, my attorney David Rosen called. David was 71 calm sharp and still wore a tie every day, even though his office had gone casual 10 years earlier. He had handled Aunt Louise's estate. He knew more about my life than most friends did. "Are you safe?" he asked first. "Yes." "And Caleb, sleeping." "Good. Then listen carefully, Margaret. Do not go back to that house alone. Do not argue with Richard by text. Save every message." "I already am." "I know you are," he said gently. "You're a librarian. You people save everything." That almost made me cry. Not because it was funny, though it was. Because someone had just reminded me I was not helpless. I had spent 38 years working in a public library outside Toledo. I knew how to organize information, how to follow paper trails, how to notice when something didn't belong. And Richard, for all his charm, had always underestimated that. 3 months before that terrible night, I had found the first statement. A credit card I didn't recognize. The charges were small at first. Lunches downtown, a boutique hotel near Columbus, jewelry. Then came the larger purchases, a weekend in Chicago, designer shoes, a spa package, all charged under a business account Richard had told me was closed. When I asked him about it, he kissed my forehead and said, "Maggie, sweetheart, don't worry your head about numbers." That was the moment I started worrying. Quietly. I made copies. I scanned receipts. I photographed envelopes before he could hide them. I checked old tax files, retirement statements, and business records he had shoved in boxes in the basement. What I found was not just an affair. It was a pattern. Richard had been moving money, some from joint savings, some from an old consulting account, some from a small trust Aunt Louise had left specifically for my care and household security. He shouldn't have touched it. Legally, he couldn't. But Richard had always believed rules were for people less charming than him. David had warned me weeks earlier. If he crosses one more line, we move. At 2 a.m., Richard hadn't just crossed the line. He danced on it. By noon, David had filed the first motions. By 2 p.m., our joint accounts were flagged. By 4 p.m., Richard's access to certain funds was frozen pending review. I knew the exact moment he found out because my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. "What did you do? Call me now. You have no idea what you're messing with." Then finally, "Margaret, we need to talk like adults." I stared at that one for a long time. Like adults. He hadn't wanted to talk like adults when he came home smelling of perfume. He hadn't wanted to talk like adults when he mocked me while I fed our son in the dark. But consequences have a way of making men suddenly polite. That evening, I sat on the cottage porch with Caleb bundled in my arms. Across the road, my neighbor Mrs. Hanley waved from her mailbox. She was 80 if she was a day with silver hair and a Cleveland brown sweatshirt. "You staying a while?" she called. "I think so." She nodded like she already knew the whole story. Good, folks heal better near water. For the first time all day I believed that might be true. 2 days later, David called again. This time his voice was different. Not worried. Focused. "Margaret," he said, "we found something." I held the phone tighter. "What?" "A signature." "Richard's?" "No," David said. "The secretary's." My mouth went dry. She signed as an authorized representative on a transfer request tied to one of Richard's old business accounts. I looked toward the bassinet where Caleb was sleeping. "What does that mean?" "It means she wasn't just his girlfriend." David paused. "It means she may have helped him move money he had no right to move." Outside, the lake rolled gray under the evening sky. For a moment I could still hear Richard's voice. "My secretary is amazing." Maybe she was. But now her name was on paper. And paper, unlike people, doesn't lie. 3 weeks after I left, Richard lost the secretary. Not because he suddenly grew a conscience. Not because he missed me. And certainly not because he had learned anything. She left because the money started disappearing. Funny how quickly romance fades when the bills arrive. I learned that later. At the time, I was sitting on the cottage porch feeding Caleb while watching a thunderstorm roll across Lake Erie. The sky was dark purple. The waves crashed against the rocks below. And for the first time in months, I felt peaceful. Life wasn't easy. Far from it. At 62, raising an infant meant operating on very little sleep. Some mornings my back hurt before my feet touched the floor. Some nights Caleb cried for hours because of teething pain. But every difficult moment felt honest. There were no lies here. No secret hotel rooms. No perfume on dress shirts. Just me and my son. One afternoon, Mrs. Hanley showed up carrying a casserole dish. "Nobody should have to cook every night with a baby," she declared. The next day, another neighbor dropped off groceries. A retired mechanic across the street repaired the cottage's broken porch railing without charging me $1. Something unexpected happened during those weeks. The people around me became family. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Meanwhile, Richard's world was moving in the opposite direction. David called regularly with updates. Every conversation seemed worse than the last. "His former business partners are asking questions," David said during one call. "What kind of questions?" "The kind people ask when they discover missing money." I rocked Caleb gently. "What happens now?" "Now they start looking. And once people started looking, they found things. Lots of things. Unauthorized transfers. Improper reimbursements. Funds moved between accounts without proper documentation. Nothing dramatic enough for a television crime show, but enough to create serious legal and financial trouble. Enough to destroy trust. Enough to attract attention. Richard had spent years building a reputation as a reliable businessman. Now that reputation was developing cracks. The secretary's signature made everything worse. She hadn't simply accepted gifts. She had signed paperwork. Approved transactions. Authorized transfers. Whether she understood what she was signing didn't matter much anymore. Her name was attached. And panic was beginning to spread. A month after I left, Richard finally stopped sending angry messages. The texts changed tone completely. First came frustration, then confusion, then desperation. One message arrived just after midnight. "I made mistakes." Another arrived 2 days later. "Can we talk?" Then, "Please don't do this." I never responded. Not because I hated him. Because there was nothing left to discuss. Actions were speaking for themselves. About 6 weeks after I moved into the cottage, David invited me to his office. Caleb sat happily in a stroller beside my chair, while David spread several documents across his desk. He adjusted his glasses, then sighed. "Richard's retirement accounts are partially frozen." I blinked. "What? Temporary review? How bad?" David folded his hands. "Bad enough that he's selling assets." For a moment I remembered the man I married. The man who once spent an entire weekend building a treehouse for my grandchildren. The man who used to bring me coffee every Sunday morning. That version of Richard felt very far away. "What about her?" I asked. "The secretary." I nodded. David smiled sadly. "She moved out." That surprised me less than it should have. "What happened?" "The same thing that usually happens." I waited. She discovered the future he promised doesn't exist. I looked down at Caleb. He was asleep, safe, unaware of the adult mistakes surrounding him. David leaned back in his chair. Margaret, I've been practicing law for 45 years. That's a long time. Long enough to know that affairs are often built on fantasy. I thought about that all afternoon. Fantasy. Richard had wanted to feel young again. Wanted admiration, excitement, escape. He wasn't the first aging man to chase those things, and he wouldn't be the last. The problem was that fantasy eventually collides with reality. Reality always wins. Summer slowly turned toward autumn. The leaves around the lake began changing color. Golden, orange, red. Caleb learned to laugh. His first real laugh happened when I accidentally sneezed while changing his diaper. The sound startled him. Then he burst into giggles. I laughed so hard I nearly cried. Moments like that healed parts of me I didn't know were broken. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in the living room folding tiny baby clothes when someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Not a neighbor. Not Mrs. Hanley. Not the mail carrier. Something about the sound felt heavier. I stood carefully. My stomach tightened. The rain tapped against the windows. Caleb slept peacefully in his bassinet. The knocking came again. I walked to the door, then looked through the glass. For a second, I barely recognized him. Richard stood on the porch. His shoulders slumped. His expensive coat looked worn. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. Even from inside the house, I could see it. He looked 10 years older. Maybe more. The man who had grinned while bragging about his secretary had disappeared. In his place stood someone tired. Someone defeated. Someone finally facing the consequences of his own choices. I rested my hand on the doorknob. Neither of us moved. Rain fell steadily between us. Then Richard lifted his eyes toward mine. And for the first time since the night I left, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Regret. Real regret. The kind that arrives far too late. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Rain drummed softly against the porch roof. Richard stood there looking like a man who had lost a fight he never expected to lose. Finally, I opened the door. Not because I was ready to forgive him. Not because I missed him. Because after 12 years of marriage, I believed every person deserved one chance to tell the truth. Come in, I said. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. The cottage suddenly felt smaller as he stepped inside. Richard looked around. At the worn hardwood floors, the old furniture, the knitted blanket draped across the couch, the bassinet near the fireplace. Then his eyes landed on Caleb. Our son was asleep. One tiny hand rested against his cheek. Richard stared longer than I expected. For a moment his face softened. Then he looked away. I pointed toward a kitchen chair. You can sit. He sat carefully, as if he didn't quite belong there. Maybe he didn't. I poured coffee into 2 mugs, the same way I had done hundreds of times before. Only now everything felt different. I placed a cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it. And then he surprised me. He started crying. Not dramatic crying. Not movie crying. The quiet kind. The kind people do when they're exhausted from carrying their own mistakes. I waited. Eventually, he wiped his eyes. I don't know where to start. Try the truth. He nodded slowly. The affair was a mistake. I didn't respond. Because that sentence wasn't nearly enough. Richard understood. It wasn't just the affair. No, it was everything. Yes. The silence stretched between us. Then he looked out the window. I retired and suddenly didn't know who I was anymore. I listened. Nobody needed me. I said nothing. My phone stopped ringing. Still nothing. The secretary, he swallowed. She made me feel important. There it was. Not love. Not passion. Vanity. The oldest story in the world. A man terrified of aging. Terrified of becoming invisible. Terrified of losing significance. So he chased attention. And destroyed everything that mattered. Richard rubbed his face. I thought I deserved happiness. You did. He blinked. What? You deserved happiness. I leaned forward. But you confused happiness with excitement. His eyes filled again. Because deep down he knew it was true. For months he had been chasing a fantasy. Meanwhile, real life had been waiting for him at home. A wife who loved him. A son who needed him. A family. Richard looked toward Caleb again. I never thought you'd actually leave. That one hurt. Not because he said it. Because he believed it. Some part of him had assumed I would stay no matter what. That I would tolerate anything. That my love had no limits. Unfortunately for Richard, he finally discovered it did. 3 hours later, he left. Before walking out, he stopped beside the bassinet. He stared at Caleb quietly, then whispered something. I almost didn't hear it. I'm sorry. The next week he called. Not to argue. Not to complain. To ask permission. Can I see him? I considered the question carefully. David advised caution. Mrs. Hanley advised caution. Even my own heart advised caution. But Caleb deserved something more important than revenge. He deserved truth. And if Richard was sincere, Caleb deserved a chance to know his father. 1 hour, I said. Thank you. The first visit was awkward. Painfully awkward. Richard showed up carrying a stuffed bear that was nearly bigger than the baby. He didn't know how to hold Caleb properly. Didn't know how to support his neck. Didn't know which bottle formula we used. He knew almost nothing. Because he hadn't been there. Watching him struggle should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt sad. A father learning things he should have learned months earlier. A man meeting consequences one diaper at a time. The second visit went better. The third better still. Within a month, Richard could change diapers. Warm bottles. Rock Caleb to sleep. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found him sitting in the rocking chair. The same rocking chair where I'd spent countless sleepless nights. Caleb was sleeping against his chest. Richard looked down at him with complete wonder, like he couldn't believe this tiny human trusted him. That image stayed with me, not because it erased the betrayal. It didn't, but because it showed me something important. People can fail spectacularly, and sometimes they can still change. Not always, but sometimes. Autumn deepened. The trees surrounding the lake turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Caleb grew stronger every week. His smile became bigger, his personality brighter, and slowly something unexpected happened. Richard stopped talking about himself, stopped talking about money, stopped talking about legal problems. Instead, every conversation became about Caleb. Did he sleep through the night? Has he started rolling over? Can I bring him a winter coat? The shift felt genuine. Not perfect, not complete, but genuine. Then one Saturday afternoon, everything changed again. Richard was sitting on the floor playing with blocks. Caleb, now nearly 8 months old, crawled across the rug toward him. I watched from the kitchen doorway. Richard smiled. Come here, buddy. Caleb stopped, looked up, and stretched both arms toward him. Richard froze. His eyes widened. Then Caleb opened his mouth. One simple word. Dada. The room became completely silent. Richard didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then tears rolled down his face. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw a glimpse of the man I once loved. Not the man who came home smelling of perfume. Not the man who chased a fantasy. Just a father, holding his son, realizing what he almost threw away forever. 5 years later, I still remember the smell of that perfume. Not because it hurts anymore, because it reminds me how quickly a life can change. Sometimes people assume revenge stories end with someone losing everything. A dramatic courtroom victory, a public humiliation, a ruined reputation. And yes, Richard lost plenty. He lost money. He lost business relationships. He lost the future he thought he was building with his secretary. But looking back now, those weren't the losses that mattered most. The real loss was time. Time with his son. Time with his family. Time he could never get back. And that's a loss no lawyer can recover. No judge can restore. No amount of money can replace. By the time Caleb turned 5, our lives looked very different from the day I drove away from that house before sunrise. The legal battles were long finished. The financial investigations had been resolved. Richard accepted responsibility for the mistakes he made. Some consequences remained. Others faded. Life moved forward, as it always does. The little cottage on Lake Erie became our permanent home. The dripping bathroom sink finally got fixed. The porch was rebuilt. The flower beds expanded every spring. Mrs. Hanley remained our closest neighbor until her passing at 86. Before she died, she told me something I still think about often. People spend too much time trying to win, she smiled, when they should be trying to heal. At the time, I simply nodded. Now I understand exactly what she meant. Because somewhere along the way, my desire for revenge disappeared. Not overnight, not easily, but gradually. I stopped caring whether Richard suffered. I stopped wondering if he regretted his choices. I stopped measuring justice by his pain. Instead, I focused on Caleb, and on building a life I was proud of. That changed everything. The truth is, the best revenge wasn't leaving. The best revenge wasn't freezing his accounts. The best revenge wasn't proving I was right. The best revenge was refusing to let his betrayal define the rest of my life. It was choosing joy anyway. Choosing peace anyway. Choosing hope anyway. And eventually Richard noticed. One evening after Caleb had gone to bed, Richard and I sat on the porch watching the sunset over the lake. It was something we had done dozens of times before. Only now there was honesty between us. No secrets, no games, no illusions. Just two aging people who had survived a terrible mistake. "I still don't understand why you gave me another chance," he said quietly. I thought about that for a long moment. Then I smiled. "I didn't." He looked confused. "What do you mean? I didn't give you another chance." The lake shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. "I gave Caleb a chance." Richard looked away, his eyes filled with tears, because he understood. Everything we rebuilt started with our son. Not our marriage, not our history, not our feelings, our son. The little boy who deserved better than the mess we created. The little boy who taught both of us what mattered. The following year, Richard moved into a small house a few miles away. Not with me. Not because we hated each other. Because rebuilding trust takes time. Real trust. Not the kind people talk about. The kind people earn. For years he showed up. Every birthday. Every school event. Every doctor's appointment. Every baseball game. No excuses. No disappearing acts. No broken promises. Just consistency. One day at a time. And slowly something remarkable happened. Forgiveness arrived. Not all at once. Not as a grand gesture. As 1,000 tiny moments. A ride to school. A family dinner. A shared laugh. A difficult conversation handled honestly. Brick by brick. Year by year. Until one day I realized I wasn't carrying the weight anymore. I had finally put it down. When Caleb turned 10, he asked me a question while we were fishing from the dock. "Mom, yeah, did you and Dad always love each other? Children have a way of finding the hardest questions." I smiled. "We always cared about each other." He frowned. "That's not what I asked." I laughed. "Nobody." He waited. "We didn't always love each other the right way." He thought about that, then nodded, as if somehow it made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Because love isn't just a feeling. It's responsibility. It's honesty. It's showing up when life gets difficult. It's choosing your family even when easier options exist. That was the lesson Richard learned too late. And the lesson Caleb learned early enough to matter. Today, when I look back on everything that happened, I don't see a story about revenge. I see a story about choices. One terrible choice can destroy a family. One honest choice can begin rebuilding it. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't getting even. It's walking away with dignity, protecting their peace, and creating a better future than the one someone else tried to take from them. If you're listening to this story and you've ever been betrayed, abandoned, or forced to start over later in life, I hope you remember something. Someone else's worst decision does not have to become the final chapter of your story. Healing is possible. Peace is possible. Even forgiveness is possible. And sometimes the life waiting for you on the other side of heartbreak is better than the one you lost. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after betrayal? What lesson helped you move forward? And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and second chances, please consider sharing and subscribing. Thank you for spending this time with me. The end.